Part of what I did was I wanted to integrate an area of science that I was already very invested in, which was in resilience theory. And I wanted to look at it in relationship to what's called the science of optimal human functioning. And that, by the way, which is called applied positive psychology, is the degree that I went back to school for. I already had a degree in advanced clinical practice from Columbia University in social work. I had had a practice for, at that point, about 10 years. But I realized there was so much more I wanted to know and understand about the science of human flourishing. And there was this whole field that had erupted sometime in the late 90s and early 2000s called applied positive psychology. It originated with Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania. And I applied to that program and was accepted. So I had already really redoubled my efforts in looking at the theory of human resilience and the science around that. And why was that important to me? Because one of the things I wanted to do was go back and look at the risk factors for complicated reactions or increased levels of suffering or reduced levels of functioning relative to the challenges that we face in our life. And so through resilience theory, we really had, and the studies that they've done over about the last 50 years, we really have a really clear understanding of what many of those risk factors are. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview, okay? So we definitely know that poverty is a risk factor for negative outcomes in people's life. Sexual and emotional and physical abuse are a risk factor. Being raised by a parent who has addiction or having addiction yourself are risk factors. And if we think about it in terms of being raised by a parent who has addiction or the absence of a caring parent figure because maybe they have mental illness or somebody is simply not present in your life, we're looking there at all of these environmental factors. And these factors are really important, but they're not nearly as important as we originally thought that they were in terms of being able to reverse our own outcomes. In other words, this is not a fait accompli where if you have these things, and one of the things I don't have on here, I'm sorry that I forgot to put it on, was something called, I think it's concussive stressors, or I don't think concussive is the right word, but think of like one stress on top of the next, on top of the next, on top of the next. So when I looked at that piece, I thought, well, isn't that chronic illness for a lot of people? The stressors might not always be at a 10, right? Like they might not always be catastrophic, but there is always this sort of ongoing challenges that people have to face, sometimes of a crisis level and sometimes at a much lower level. But what does that do in terms of helping people develop good or dysfunctional outcomes? And so when I looked at this, I looked at, okay, these are the environmental factors. If you were raised in poverty and there was nothing you could do about that, if you were raised in abuse, if you had an addicted parent, if there was an absence of a caring parent figure, right? These things are incredibly important. But when I look at the bottom three, and I don't mean to dismiss them at all, but I'm saying even if that is the setup for your whole life long before you're diagnosed with chronic illness, that still does not guarantee a negative outcome. When we looked at these bottom three, social and emotional avoidance, meaning in the presence of suffering or struggling to withdraw yourself from potential support, something called negative attribution style, which is how do we think about what's happening to us, and a locus of control, which is how much do I believe that I can influence my own life. So when you see external locus of control, that's where people believe that they really don't have any power in their own life, that external events are really going to be the determining factor over whether they're okay or not in the world. I found these pieces to be incredibly important for people dealing with chronic illness, and really wanted to understand, well, what would happen if we could focus on these things that we have some control over: avoidance, attribution style, which is the way that we talk to ourselves about what's happening, and that sense of locus of control, that everything is outside of ourselves. So when something negative happens in somebody's life, and there are a number of different studies that I could talk about that are relative to this, but just to say it very briefly, and you have those risk factors that I just talked about here, right? What we would traditionally expect is that people who have a combination of negative experiences that happen in their life, stressors that happen, and have those risk factors would fall at that left side of this bell curve. meaning that they would have the poorest outcomes. And maybe they might even get to the left side of the top part of the bell curve, but you're looking at a group of people for whom we would expect the worst outcomes. But what we've seen through the science of resilience is that actually isn't the case. It is for many people, but we've seen a number of people who have had all of those risk factors, or many of those external risk factors, meaning the environmental ones, growing up in poverty, growing up without a significant caregiver, or at least not a primary mother or father who's able to be a good caregiver, growing up with addiction around them, who actually end up becoming about a third of the people who have all of those environmental issues become what are called our highest performers. And that became the basis of the study of resilience, which is, well, why is that? What's happening for that particular group of people? Is there some kind of immunity that they have that keeps them from having these anticipated worst case scenario outcomes?